እንደሚታወቀው በትናንትናው ዕለት መንግስት ሀገሪቱ በማካሄድ ላይ ስላለችው
Since July 29, 2024, the Ethiopian birr has plummeted by an astonishing 95% in value due to austerity measures recommended by the International Monetary Fund. While this agreement promises long-term economic benefits, its immediate impact on the daily lives of Ethiopians has been profound. So, what does the future hold? Will this deal lead Ethiopia to prosperity, or could it drive the country into an economic abyss? In today's episode, we will explore Egypt's recent experience with IMF austerity measures to shed light on what might be in store for Ethiopia. In November 2016, Egypt secured a $12 billion loan from the IMF under a 3-year extended fund facility, targeting fiscal consolidation, macroeconomic stability, and structural reforms. Alongside this, Egypt received an additional $10.5 billion from the World Bank to support energy security, fiscal health, and the growth of the small and medium enterprises. In contrast, in July 2024, Ethiopia secured a $3.5 billion loan from the IMF under an extended credit facility focused on macroeconomic stability, modernizing monetary policy, and ensuring fiscal sustainability. Ethiopia also obtained $16.5 billion in loans from the World Bank to fund its 10-year development plan and homegrown economic development plan. After securing the IMF loan, Egypt transitioned from a fixed to a floating exchange rate, leading to a 60% depreciation of the Egyptian pound. This devaluation triggered a sharp rise in inflation, peaking at over 30% and significantly increasing the cost of living. To control inflation, the Central Bank of Egypt raised interest rates to 27.25% by July 2024. While these high rates helped stabilize the currency and control inflation, they also slowed economic growth by making borrowing more expensive for businesses and consumers. However, it succeeded in curbing the black market for foreign currency by aligning the official exchange rate with market reality. In Ethiopia, the birr has depreciated by 95% since July, yet inflation has remained relatively stable, decreasing from 23.3% in May 2024 to around 19.9% in July. This stability could be due to the Ethiopian economy's adaptation to black market exchange rates for most imports and the government's enforcement of strict anti-price gouging laws. The National Bank of Ethiopia has maintained the interest rate at 15% as of July 26th, but further monetary adjustments may be needed to stabilize the birr in the coming months. So what's the takeaway? Well, both Egypt and Ethiopia faced significant currency devaluations due to IMF-recommended austerity measures. While Egypt's approach effectively eliminated the black currency market, it led to high inflation and economic slowdown due to high interest rates. Ethiopia has managed to keep inflation relatively stable despite a sharp currency depreciation. Balancing inflation control with economic growth will remain a critical challenge for both nations. The International Monetary Fund's fiscal policy recommendations for Ethiopia and Egypt share common goals, but differ in approaches. Both countries aim to increase government revenue while gradually reducing subsidies. Ethiopia plans to boost revenue by introducing new taxes and expanding its tax base. Furthermore, the agreement allocates 1.5% of Ethiopia's GDP to pro-poor programs, increasing funding for social initiatives to protect vulnerable populations. The Ethiopian government also plans to provide temporary subsidies for imported items like fuel and fertilizer. Essentially, Ethiopia is trying to balance the impact of the agreement by increasing social spending while simultaneously raising revenue through tax adjustments. In contrast, Egypt reduced subsidies on fuel and electricity, which had mainly benefited wealthier segments of the population. Alongside these cuts, the government introduced a value-added tax and other fiscal measures aimed at reducing the budget deficit and public debt. However, these measures, combined with high inflation, disproportionately affected low and middle-income households. Despite efforts to mitigate these effects through increased social spending and targeted subsidies, the burden on poorer segments of the population was significant. So what's the takeaway here? Ethiopia and Egypt both aim to increase government revenue and reduce subsidies, but their approaches differ significantly. Ethiopia focuses on expanding its tax base and increasing social spending to protect vulnerable populations. Egypt's strategy of cutting subsidies and introducing a value-added tax placed a heavier burden on lower-income groups. The IMF also recommended significant structural reforms in both countries to privatize the economy and reduce government bureaucracy, aiming to boost economic activity and create jobs. Under the IMF agreement, Egypt undertook major structural reforms, including privatizing state-owned enterprises like the Bank of Cairo, the United Bank, Egyptair, and the Suez Canal Authority. The government also redirected resources from some infrastructure projects to focus on critical economic reforms. However, the results of Egypt's privatization efforts were mixed.
It's difficult working out exactly who gets the profits and how much, because Egyptian military accounts are not shared with anyone at all, either outside Egypt or even inside Egypt.
The military's significant role in the economy remains a barrier to private sector growth, with only 14 of 35 state-owned companies sold by the end of 2023. Similarly, the IMF has urged Ethiopia to privatize state-owned enterprises, meaning that major entities like the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, Ethio Telecom, and Ethiopian Airlines could soon be considered for privatization. The key difference between Ethiopia's and Egypt's structural reforms lies in the additional funding they received from the World Bank and other financial institutions. Ethiopia's $16 billion from the World Bank is focused on its 10-year economic development plan, with significant investments in infrastructure projects like roads, railways, and renewable energy to stimulate growth and create jobs, potentially easing short-term inflation from subsidy cuts and currency devaluation. Conversely, Egypt's $12 billion loan was aimed primarily at reducing the budget deficit, enhancing revenue collection, and fostering inclusive growth. While Egypt's deal centered on stabilizing the economy and reducing debt, Ethiopia's agreement emphasizes economic development through infrastructure investment. Whether the IMF agreements in Egypt have worked depends on who you ask. Today, Egypt's economy faces high inflation, a weak currency, and substantial foreign debt. Heavy reliance on revenue from remittances, tourism, and the Suez Canal makes it vulnerable to external shocks. These factors contributed to soaring inflation and rising poverty levels in 2023. Ethiopia, like Egypt, had little choice but to accept the IMF's terms. To succeed, Ethiopia must demonstrate discipline and address long-standing issues that have persisted for centuries. In the end, two truths are clear. One, the coming years will be difficult for the average Ethiopian. Two, without strong efforts to tackle corruption and resolve conflicts, this endeavor is likely to fail before it even begins.